right, let's go through the creation accounts. So it's going to seem like we're going through the Old Testament relatively slow here for a month because the foundations of the whole Bible are in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and I don't want to skimp on them at all. So this week we'll cover the creation. Next week we'll cover the fall of mankind when sin entered the world. In 2 weeks we'll look at the flood of Noah, and then we have the Tower of Babel. And those 4 stories explain the world as we know it today better than anything else in the world. So today we're just going to start with the creation. Did everybody get a chance to read Genesis 1 and 2? Very good. Because in the scriptures, unique amongst all the various different creation myths and stories around the world, the Bible actually has 2 accounts, not just 1. Did anybody notice that? Chapter 2 reviews an awful lot of stuff that happened in chapter 1. There's a different rendering. They're complementary, they're not contradictory, which is convenient. It's not like in the Babylonian tradition, I think they have an alligator getting cut in half, and one half is used to form the stars in the sky, and the other half is used to form the world. And it's not like they have one version where you have an alligator getting cut in half, and then the other version it's a hippopotamus or an elephant or something of the sort. The 2 accounts actually line up quite nicely with each other, but they are different. So the first account is in Genesis 1, and this is a very nice systematic presentation of the 6 days. Kayla, do you want to open up to Genesis chapter 1? Go ahead and read verses 3 through 5.
Okay. Oh, I did not expect to catch that.
Good.
God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day.
All right. So that was the first day's worth of accounts. And we'll notice some of the refrains that happen here. And God said, and God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning. And then it's going to be the first day, the second day, the third day, and so forth. So, Kayla, go ahead and read day 2, verses 6 through 8.
Okay. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse, and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called that expanse heavens. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day."
There we go. So there's a pattern here that we see. God speaks, things come into existence, and then it gets declared good most days. Not every day. Day 2 did not get declared good. It was just the sky.
Proof that Tuesdays are evil.
Yep. All right. So as we talked about last week, this is a form of exalted prose that is designed to be really easy to remember, to be retold orally. It wasn't designed as a written account originally, although it is now written down. And so we've got these refrains and we've got this pattern that makes it very easy to get from one day into the next day and so forth. Now there is one verse of poetry in this account, and that is Genesis 1:27, where God says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them." One of the things we remember about Hebrew poetry is that it tends to be quite repetitive. The first line oftentimes is repeated in the second line, sometimes in reverse order. So it says in the first line, God created man in his own image, and then we reverse it. In the image of God, he created him, referring to man. And then in this particular form, we actually get an expansion on the idea in the third line, male and female, he created them. Which is important to note because when God created mankind, he was thinking of man and woman, not just men. It's the old English version of man, referring to the entire kind, just like we would think of the oak kind or the lion kind or something else like that. There's another thing I want to point out here, and this is on day 4. Michaela, could you read verse 16?
Sure. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars.
All right. Greater light, lesser light. What is he talking about? Sun and the moon. So this is an interesting thing that I learned in my Hebrew class. They don't use the Hebrew word for the sun and the moon because those were the names of their neighbors' gods, Shemash and something else. So the Ammonites and the Moabites worshipped the sun and the moon, and those were the words that were used to refer to the sun and the moon. It was just the name of the neighboring god. So remember the Egyptians, they also worshipped the sun, and the sun god was named Ra. And I don't remember what they named the moon god. Should remember that, but I don't. Anyway, so it's actually much the same way in English. We have Sunday and we have Monday. We have the day of the sun and we have the day of the moon. Thursday is actually the day of Thor, the Norse god. And Saturday is named after some Roman festival called the Saturnalia. Is there another one you remember, Ariana? Not sure. Friday and Tuesday and Wednesday, I don't remember what they're named after. But in any case, in Genesis 1:16, God didn't want it to sound like he created the sun god and the moon god, so he depersonified them and just called them the big light and the little light, or the greater light and the lesser light. He doesn't create a pantheon of gods because this is what most of the other neighboring peoples believed. We'll worship this god, somebody else can worship that god, and there's this whole big pantheon, lots of gods out there, and we pick one that we want to worship. And God wasn't even going to leave any room for that to be interpreted into the creation account. He didn't create all the other gods. There are no other gods. So he just created a big light and a little light so nobody could get confused. And it's really fascinating how intentional that is, because it's really awkward if you read through verse 16 to realize we have a greater light and a lesser light. Like, why wouldn't we just call that the sun and the moon? There's a reason. One of the other things that comes across in this creation account is actually an illustration of the Trinity. Just in Genesis 1:1, which I think is the memory verse for next week, we have in the beginning, which is the creation of time. There was no time before the beginning. And then we have God created the heavens, that's creating space, and he created the earth, which is creating matter. So we have 3 things that he creates in the first instant of the universe: time, space, and matter. 3 things that create the universe, and each of those 3 things can actually be divided down into 3 smaller subparts. Time has a past, a present, and a future. So you have 3 parts in one. Past is different than the future, but it is still related to time. Space, you have a length, you have a width, and you have a height, and that creates 3-dimensional space as we understand it. God created the heavens, he created 3-dimensional space throughout the universe. That is how we understand space. And you can't have space if you take one of those parts away. All 3 of them are necessary to understand space. And then we have matter, or all the stuff you can feel. And this, if you look down at the atomic level, is also another 3 in 1. Because matter is made out of protons, neutrons, and electrons. And if it's antimatter, then it's the opposite. You have an antiproton and a positron, but you still have neutrons. And don't let the 2 of them get together because they explode. So, that is another conversation for another time, actually. But anyway, so we have all 3 of these. They give us a proper illustration of the Trinity, where we have one God, but he's got 3 different persons representing him. We have the Father, we have the Son, and we have the Holy Spirit. And God is all 3 of them at the same time, much like the universe is time, space, and matter. All right, any questions on that? That was heavy and deep. I have a handout then. Back to the table behind you. You have this. So this can be your cheat sheet for remembering the creation order. study guide for next week, potentially.
Make a presence.
Now, if you look at this handout, you'll notice there's actually a pattern. What do we have created on day 1 and day 4? Time, space, matter. What's at the bottom of that list? Light. And then what do we have on day 4? Sources of light. The sun, the moon, and the stars. So on day 1, we have light created. There's no source of the light, but light was created. 3 days later, then we have the sources of light. The sun, the moon, which actually just reflects light, but it does light up the night, and then stars are also a source of light. Day 2, we have the atmosphere getting separated out from the waters. So we have the sky. And on day 5, God creates the inhabitants of the sky and the seas. The fish and the birds get created. And that's probably fish in the broadest sense of sea creatures, including octopus and squid and things of that nature. Whales, yes. They're actually named. Behemoth, I think, is the great sea creatures of the deep. That's how it's written. Yes. And then day 3, we have dry land and vegetation created. And on day 6, we have the land animals, which live on the dry land and eat the vegetation. And then mankind is also created at the end of day 6. Now, what is missing from the creation account that we know exists because it's in our world, but it's not specifically denoted? Insects. What day were insects created, do you suppose?
Day 6.
Good shot on day 6. Some of them live in the water. Maybe they were day 5.
Is there a verse that states that he created food for the birds and the fish? Or is there? I forgot.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a year since I read Genesis.
A year? I thought you read it in the last week.
For 1 and 2.
Okay, right. If it's not in there, it's not recorded. Food, all the plants were given to the animals and to mankind as food. So, all right. So insects are not specifically mentioned. Can you think of anything else? Or something that seems like it might be glossed over? Comets. Right. That's included in that all-encompassing word of stars, which includes comets, other planets in the solar system, asteroids, and the fact that they're organized into solar systems and galaxies and all the exoplanets that are orbiting around all the other stars. That and the stars is like the biggest glossing over comment of the entire creation. Anything else missing?
Angels.
Angels, good observation. We don't have any supernatural creatures that are mentioned in the creation of the world. These are all natural things that we can observe. Supernatural things aren't mentioned here. But we can run across angels later in the scriptures and other creatures of the sort, and so they must have been created at some point in time too. Will, you had your hand up. Anything else?
Sure.
No? All right. Microbes, viruses, bacteria, fungus.
No mushrooms.
Yes, well, they weren't mentioned. The thing to note here is that this is a very good overview, but it wasn't meant to be completely exhaustive. There's lots of things to discover.
I think he created mushrooms on day 3. That's my personal theory.
Mm-hmm.
Probably.
It's a good theory.
It is.
Mhm.
He shouldn't have created mushrooms.
All right. So, moving on to the second account. This is found in Genesis chapter 2. This is much more of a meandering presentation, and almost everything that's referenced is something that happens on day 6 or a description of things that were significant on day 6. But the key point here is it describes the Garden of Eden, which God planted, and the geography around it, and then also the creation of Adam and Eve. And this is also mostly a prose account, but once again, there is one poetic verse in the midst of it. This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. It's not metaphors, no similes. Nothing's personified here except God and Adam and Eve. And what do you know? Adam and Eve are actually people, so they're personified. Now, one thing I'll point out here is a piece of geography. Geography of our world today is somewhat changed from what was originally created, and we can discern that out of this verse, or this passage here. Verse 10 says, "A river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and there it divided and became 4 rivers. The name of the first is the Pishon. It is the one that flowed around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is good. Bdellium and onyx stone are there. The name of the second river is the Gihon. It is the one that flowed around the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is the Tigris, which flows east of Assyria, and the fourth river is the Euphrates." Now, has anybody heard of the Tigris and Euphrates River? Where do we find it?
Part of the Fertile Crescent,
Yes, which is
Middle East.
in the Middle East, right?
Sweet.
Are those 2 rivers the same 2 rivers as are described here? You don't know. You don't think so. Anybody else want to venture? I don't believe that they are, because the river that's described here starts as a single river flowing out of Eden, and then it divides in 4 ways and goes 4 different directions. The Tigris and the Euphrates actually don't start in the same location. They actually flow into each other and then go out into the Persian Gulf as a single river by Kuwait. And the other thing is that they seem to flow over the top of about 2.5 miles of flood sediments, which means that they could not be the same rivers. So, what we have here is something that happened between Europe and North America when people were settling and migrating across the Atlantic Ocean. Does anybody know that song, Istanbul, not Constantinople?
Yeah.
We'll play it later. It's by They Mighty Giants. Istanbul's Constantinople. Anyway, so one of the verses is, "Even old New York was once New Amsterdam." Now, where's old Amsterdam?
That would be
Netherlands, right. It's in Europe. So the Dutch moved from Amsterdam to New Amsterdam on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, and they named their city Amsterdam, but they call it New Amsterdam to differentiate from the old Amsterdam, because they're both in existence. And then 40 years later, the British decide they want that colony, and so they buy it or steal it from the Dutch. And they change the name of it because you can't have a Dutch named colony if it's under the British crown, and so they change it to York. But there is a York, there's an old York, and so there has to be a New York. And so now we have New York today. After the flood, the original Tigris and Euphrates were destroyed, so we didn't have an old Tigris and an old Euphrates, we just had the new versions. So we have the Tigris and Euphrates today, but they're not the original 2 created.
Did they also do that with Cush and Assyria then?
Presumably Cush and Assyria were different than 2. Names from the pre-flood world landed in the post-flood world, and we see that here. All right. Moving on, we're going to look at when all of this happened. And there was a brighter man than myself, whose name was James Ussher. He was the Archbishop of Armagh in the Church of Ireland, speaking of the old world. and he calculated the date of the creation of the world to the year 4004 BC. And he was working with the Julian calendar back then because they hadn't updated it to the Gregorian calendar, which we use today. But in his version of the calendar, October 23rd was the autumnal equinox, which he assumed would be the first day of the year because a lot of ancient calendars used the autumnal equinox to begin their year. So we assumed that must be when it was created. Now there were a few assumptions into this calculation. One of them is that the first day of creation would also be a Sunday. And it just so happens that October 23rd also is a Sunday in addition to being the autumnal equinox. That actually correlates. Say what?
I said, what a coincidence.
What a coincidence, exactly. He also assumes that days and months get accounted for throughout the Old Testament as we're working our way backward to figure out when this actually happened. There's a few assumptions in there, but they're pretty reasonable, and we actually discover that most of the days and months do get accounted for. Like I mentioned earlier, he has it close to the autumnal equinox. That was the Jewish New Year. Has anybody heard of the holiday Rosh Hashanah? Or seen it on the calendar, perhaps? That
I
is,
didn't know what it was called, but it makes sense now.
yes.
That was just random letters.
Random letters, exactly. It is the Jewish New Year, and it always lands around September 21st now because September 21st is usually the autumnal equinox.
Ooh.
So, what we're going to do is look through the passages by which he used to calculate this. Because if you ask your artificial intelligence at home, we have Alexa in our household, how old is the Earth? She'll say it's 4.5 billion years old. That differs a little bit from 4004 BC, because that would only be 6,027 or 28 now, to figure out which one it is here. This is coming up in a week. Anyway, so first passage we'll look at 2 Kings 25:27. This is one of those crazy passages. It says, in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, evil Murdoch, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, graciously freed Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from prison.
I know that guy.
Yes, you do. Now, most of you probably don't know who Jehoiakim is. You don't know who evil Murdoch is. Maybe you've heard of Babylon. We're going to get to all of that. But in the meantime, this particular event is actually well established in secular history because the Greeks and the Romans recorded history about this far back. So we actually know when evil Murdoch became the king of Babylon, and so we know when Jehoiakim ended up getting released. And this is October 7th, 562 BC. So that gives us a really nice starting date. So we get to the end of the Old Testament history, and we can connect this precise event to the day. It's not even a fuzzy year or just a month or a season. And this also happens to be the 37th year in the 12th month and on the 27th day of the month of Jehoiakim's exile. So that allows us to jump backwards to when he got exiled. And then you can go back through a whole bunch of passages that are like this one. In the 18th year of King Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, Ahijah began to reign over Judah, and he reigned for 3 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom. And there are approximately 42 of those passages that you can string together and go backwards from Jehoiakim all the way back to King Solomon. And King Solomon is really significant because there's this passage in his reign. In the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. So this means that from the very beginning of Solomon's construction of the temple, which we have nailed down to his 4th year, and we know the month, we can jump all the way back to when the Exodus took place. Now this is an interesting thing here because how many years have transpired since the Exodus? You're not a student, remember, you're quiet.
480.
Nope. because it's been the
like today.
no, right there in that passage. It says in the 480th year, which means that 479 years have elapsed. Because when you were 1 week old, you were in your first year of life, but you were 0. It's the difference between an ordinal number and a cardinal number. So, when you woke up this morning, it was the first day of the week, right? But a full day of the week had not actually transpired yet, right? So it's still in the 0th day. It was in the first day, but 0 days had actually transpired. Now when you wake up tomorrow, it'll be the second day of the week, and how many days will have gone by? 1. So in this particular case, the 480th year means that 479 years have gone by. Does that make sense? So then we can jump backwards 479 years. And we have this passage in Exodus 12:40. It says that the time the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years, and at the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. And that was on the 15th day of the first month of their year. And it names it as the month of Aviv. But that was a different year starting point, actually. That would have been in April, which is why Passover is right in Easter, are typically celebrated end of March and early April. Now there's a footnote to this though, because we learned last week that there's a few discrepancies in some of the scriptural accounts. We have one in this particular passage. Somebody want to look up Exodus chapter 12, verse 40.
The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years.
Yes, is there a footnote though? An A or a B that references to the bottom of the page?
No.
Okay, not in the ESV.
It's just about like
Alright, in the NIV, there's a footnote. It's a good thing I put it in the slide there, which is here. The Masoretic text says it's 430 years to the day since they left Egypt. But in other versions of other texts, the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint specifically, it says Egypt and Canaan. So 430 years in Egypt would be from when the Israelites moved down to Egypt. But if it was 430 years in Egypt and Canaan, then that would be when Abraham entered the land of Israel. And so then we look at Galatians 3:17, and this is our trusty passage that helps us narrow down which of these would be the more appropriate passage. Paul writes that the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say and to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. This is what I mean, the law, which came 430 years afterward, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God, so as to make the promise void. So in the New Testament here, we see that the 430-year period goes way back to Abraham, not just Jacob, because the law came 430 years after Abraham. So we're working back, and we've made it all the way back to Abraham, and we're actually jumping back into Genesis now. In Genesis 12:4, it says, Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran, and he ends up in the land of Canaan on the 15th day of the first month of the year, because it was 430 years later to the day when they left. And if we get back this far, then it gets pretty easy. You'll read through a few of these in the next few weeks. We have passages like this chronogenealogy in Genesis 11. It says, when Arpachshad had lived 35 years, he fathered Shelah, and when Arpachshad had lived after he fathered Shelah 403 years, he had other sons and daughters. When Shelah had lived 30 years, he fathered Eber, and Shelah lived after he fathered Eber 403 years and had other sons and daughters. So you take your 30, you add your 35, and we know that 65 years have elapsed since the birth of the first one to when the birth of the grandson was there. So you can add these up from Abraham all the way back to Noah. What happens in Noah's life? Do we remember? What do you think? There's a flood. And that flood is actually dated rather precisely. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. It's precision there. We not only know the year, we know the day, or the month and the day. Just like when Solomon began building the temple, just like when the Israelites left Egypt. And then before the flood, we have another passage like this. It says, when Enosh had lived 90 years, he fathered Kenan. Enosh lived after he fathered Kenan 815 years and had other sons and daughters. Then all the days of Enosh's life were 905 years, and he died. That is a really long lifespan.
Like, did they just like really slowly age, or did they just be like, did they age like we do and then just be so shriveled by the time they were 1,000 years old?
Yeah, so Noah was over 500 years old when he had his 3 sons, so I don't think he was aging at the same rate.
That sounds more logical.
Yep, and even Abram and Sarah were expecting to get pregnant and have children at the age of 75 and 85, which is not common.
But Sarah did laugh at the notion.
That was a few years later. Yes.
Right. Oh, I suppose when they were.
Yep. So, anyhow, that is how James Ussher calculated 4004 BC. Now, do you think that's plausible? Do you think it's plausible the Earth came to existence in 6 days? Look at this in youth group here in a bit. So one of the things that we'll point out about Creation Week is how much supernatural stuff was going on. So we have science. Science is really useful. I really enjoy science and I study it all the time. The catch is that it is the observation, identification, description, and investigation of natural phenomena, whereas religion involves the belief and reverence in supernatural phenomena. So has anybody ever spoken anything into existence here? You haven't? I haven't? Have you? No? So if God speaks light into existence, that would qualify as supernatural, because it doesn't normally happen, right? And then when he decides to call forth dry land from the bottom of the depths of the sea, that too is supernatural, because we don't call forth islands out of the ocean. Volcanoes make them emerge occasionally. When he vegetates all the land, that too is calling forth into existence something with his voice. Now, how fast does a tree normally grow? Has anybody ever planted a tree? When did you plant a tree, Will?
Like 2 years ago,
Yep. How big was that tree when you planted it?
maybe like 6 feet tall.
And how big is it now?
It's dead.
Yes, that happens.
We did some pine trees about like 8 years ago. They grow about maybe 6-7 feet so far.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing about the vegetation that God put on the earth is that on the 6th day he said to Adam and Eve that everything that produces fruit is for you for food. And so he seems to have created forests that were fully mature, producing fruit by the 3-day mark after that, so that everything was ready for Adam and Eve to eat. So we know that small seeds don't grow into full-size trees bearing fruit in 3 days. That would be a supernatural rate of growth. Many things happen that way that week. There are stars that are about 13.2 billion light years away that have been observed by the James Webb Telescope. Light doesn't move 13.2 billion miles that fast, but that day it seems to have. God said, let there be stars, and it wasn't that they were out there and waiting to turn on and the light get here. the light seems to have grown out of the stars so that it was a ready starry sky for Adam and Eve when they were here on the sixth day to be observed. We can see stars that are far further away than their light should have been able to make it here. It's one of the supernatural things that happened on that day. In the same way, Adam and Eve were not made babies. They weren't little embryos. They were made full-grown human beings ready to reproduce, and that doesn't happen either. How many children did you have, Sarah? 3. Did any of them come out adults?
No.
Are any of them adults yet?
No.
Right, it takes a lot of time for them to get to adults. Adam and Eve were adults on day 6 when they were created. They weren't made small. And so through the entirety of the creation, God was creating everything with its maturity necessary to be fully functioning and operational. And this goes from light to plants to stars to people, fish. Everything that he created was mature and ready to go. Another thing I'll point out here is the 24-hour day. I ran into one pastor who thought that it was possible that the earth had been around longer because there wasn't a sun on days 1, 2, and 3, and so how would we know if a day was actually a day? So how do we measure the length of a day? You're not a student. Well,
Rotation of the earth.
it's the rotation of the earth. Very good. So God separated the day from the night on the very first day. And so he had a light source. Don't know what the source of light was. May have just been himself. It was on one side of the earth, and quite apparently that earth he created spinning so that we had day and night. It would have been spinning presumably at a 24-hour rate, just like it is today. And as the earth spun around, they could measure a day. And that is the consistent meaning of the Hebrew word for day, which is the word yom. And then, of course, through Genesis 1, it's reinforced by you have evening and you have morning. First day, the second day, the third day. It's not talking about eons, millennia, and things of the sort. All right. Jumped ahead of myself a few times here. How many slides do I go forward? All right. Created complete and complex. Lots of symbiotic relationships were built right into the creation. Plants, fungus, and insects. You need plants, but you can't have plants continuing to reproduce after themselves if you don't have insects. Honeybees being critical. You need honeybees, otherwise the plants don't continue to the next generation. Presumably God created the insects really quickly, so they were ready for the plants to be able to reproduce. Plants and animals also live in this symbiotic relationship. Plants translate or transfer the energy from the sun into something, a form of energy that animals and people can then create and use. And we also have some irreducible complexity that's built right into the creation. To have a wing operational, you have to have feathers. You need to have an incredibly huge wing muscle right here. And then you also have to have really, really light hollow bones for the wing to be able to be light enough. And a few other things probably need to be in place. You got different types of feathers. You have your flight feathers and your directional feathers and such like that. Take any one of those away, it doesn't work, and critter doesn't survive very long. Take an eyeball. Anybody seen a diagram of the human eye? Maybe?
Like in 4th grade.
Like in 4th grade? Alright, we're dredging the depths of our memories. Ryan, what part of an eyeball do you remember is there?
Retina.
There's a retina.
And I remember the cornea.
Cornea. We're going
And
2 for 2.
I remember the lady in the video said, if your retina is far back, that means that you're something sided, and if your retina is like up front, that means you're other something sided.
Not an eye doctor to know if you're right or wrong on that, but yes. You need a lens. You need to have a hole in your eye to actually let light through. A pupil.
Oh, okay,
The
good.
hole is not white all the way around your eye. And then the crazy thing is the color part of our eyes is the iris, And that gets larger and smaller when your pupils dilate and such to let more light in or less light in. And that is really important because we exist during the daytime when the sun's really bright, and we need to have really small pupils because we don't need much light to see everything. And then at nighttime, our pupils have to get really big so we can soak in enough light to be able to see things. And then we have cones and rods that receive color and light and dark, all kinds of things. Take any one of those pieces out of an eyeball, the eyeball doesn't work, and the critter has no sense of sight.
That's
Wait.
It succumbs quickly.
Yeah.
So you can like, if I like really dedicated myself, I could take this pen and put it into my eyeball.
No. The hole is just something that is transparent to allow light in. It will not allow the pen into your eyeball. Be careful with you. You remind me of Ansley, one of my younger daughters.
Yeah, let's not go ahead and start poking ourselves in the eyes.
Please don't.
Bad things happen when that happens.
Alright, I think we're going to jump forward here to this one. This is another interesting part of the creation here. Genesis 1:12, it says, "The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which there is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good." So a kind is defined by whether it can reproduce with another member of its kind or not, which means that if something will hybridize, we know they're the same kind, and if they can't, then they won't. So, think about your fruit that you get at a grocery store. What kinds of fruit are very similar and have the same kind of seeds?
Lemons and limes.
Yes, lemons and limes. What else is in that family?
Citrus.
Yep,
Orange.
oranges. Anyone else?
Buddha's hand.
What?
Buddha's hand.
I don't know what that one is.
It's another citrus.
Another citrus, yeah.
Mango.
Mango is not a citrus. Grapefruit. Sure. Oranges, grapefruit, oranges, mandarin oranges. They're all part of the citrus kind, which means you can hybridize them together, but they reproduce after their own kind. You'll never get an orange tree to produce an apple, though. There is another fruit, though, that we think of as a different species, but it's actually the same kind. And if you look at their seeds, they're identical to an apple seed. What other fruit commonly purchased in a grocery store is,
Pear.
yes, a pear. Pears and apples seem to be the same created kind, because you can take their flowers and hybridize and produce a viable fruit.
Nothing. Never mind. Don't mind me.
Crab apples would be another type of that. So a kind and a species are not necessarily the same. Right. Wrapping up here. Anybody have any questions over the creation accounts? All right. What year did James Ussher say that? Calculate that God created the earth?
4,000 something.
4,000 something. 4004 BC. Does anybody remember the day and the month?
October 23rd.
Third.
Oh,
Yes,
so
very
close.
good. October 23rd. That was in the Julian calendar. So when is that today in the Greek? Yes, September 21st, the autumnal equinox. So we're coming up on a new year in a lot of ways. Coming up here. All right. What do we have for readings for next week? So we're going to flip open to the homeworks page. All right. Genesis 3 and 4. Those will be on the fall of man, and then Psalm 1, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And those are nice and short and easy. So it's easy reading this week. What's our memory verse?
Genesis 1.
Genesis
That's
1
not
1.
hard.
Nope, that's not hard. Can you say it now?
In the beginning, something.
God created the heavens.
You
You
make
don't
me
get
look
chocolate
so
yet.
dumb.
Wait until next week to get the chocolate.
Next week we get the chocolate.
Are you sure you can handle that one though?
All right. We will call it there then. Good job, everyone.